The Dark Gods by Anthony Roberts and Jeff Gilbertson. Part 1. Chapter 1. The Cosmic Connection. Aghast the children of men stood on the infinite earth and saw these visions in the air, but many stood silent and busied in their families. And many said, "We see no visions in the darksome air. Measure the course of that sulfur orb that lights the darksome day. Set stations on this breeding earth and let us buy and sell." Mighty was the draught of voidness to draw existence in. William Blake, Vala, or the Four Zoas. Deities have appeared in forms so visible that they have compelled everyone who is not senseless or hardened in impiety to confess the presence of the gods. Marcus Tullius Cicero, of the Nature of the Gods. It is remarkable to what extent the flying saucer legend has incorporated former beliefs and superstitions, some of which were apparently moribund, and others embedded for centuries in Christian mythology. Among them are the belief that people can vanish from the face of the earth, often for pursuing too zealously certain lines of inquiry into secret affairs. The belief in another race of men-like creatures, occasionally seen on earth, but belonging to a different order of existence from our own. The tradition of the gods from the sky and of the sacred mandala, the winged disk bringing both gifts and destruction. And finally, the expectation of an approaching millennium, when another order of life will appear on earth. John Michel, The Flying Saucer Vision. The human religious impulse, the will to worship, has sadly been one of the great psychic irritants throughout history. This is not because the ethos of the human-viewed universe is inherently Marxist or reductionist, but rather that the wells of religious understanding have been systematically poisoned, or, more accurately, infected by what can only be termed outside intervention. The whole pattern of creation glows across the cosmos as a mighty, interconnected web of being that fits a harmonious scheme, ranging from the smallest spark of particle physics to the thundering music of the quasars, those beacons of light that illuminate the spaces of infinity. But the pattern is constantly marred. The light and music of creation are dimmed and made discordant by dark shadows and the harsh litany of a deliberately confusing evil. This evil issues from sources that are perennially hostile to the development of a true understanding of creative existence, and it has manifested itself throughout time. These opening statements are not meant to be obscurantist or over-romantic, but are a brief attempt to establish a quick perspective for the contents of this book. Many readers will find the concepts dealt with here eerily fantastic, strangely familiar, and extremely frightening. They are all of that and more. The idea that the human race has been consistently plagued throughout its history by dark forces is of course not a new one. All religions make reference to the powers of evil and have elaborate hierarchies of spirits, angels, and demons engaged in an endless struggle for mastery of the cosmic environment and, incidentally, human destiny. The great pagan religions that preceded Christianity and Islam were all possessed of an intimate knowledge of these spiritual forces, categorizing them as gods and goddesses, fairies and elementals, and various personifications of the diverse energies of nature. Far back in the depths of so-called prehistory, it is now known that the human race was aware of and paid homage to transcendent beings that existed outside the realms of temporal reality, but manifested within it. All over the world, these beings are variously represented among the detritus of religious experience, leaving a residue in philosophy, art, architecture, and most important of all, in the wandering souls of this planet's most dominant life form. In nearly every culture, past and present, the religious ethos consistently takes on a polarizingly dualistic form. This is naturally a great oversimplification, but it is basically an accurate one because of its clarifying potential. The conflict, on its most elemental level, has always been seen as binary. The war was between order and chaos, good and evil, light and darkness, heaven and hell, demons and angels, etc. But it was and is always seen as a direct confrontation of opposing forces for mastery of what can only be termed the pure state of existence. This needs some qualification if it is to be made coherently comprehensible within the framework of this book. This is not the place to discuss advanced metaphysics in detail, but nevertheless it is in the metaphysical sphere that any argument concerning gods, demons, and elementals has to be located. The intuitive recognition of a religious power throughout nature and the various forms it adopts is as natural to humanity as breathing. The atheistic viewpoint has risen to prominence only since the oddly misnamed Age of Enlightenment, when the mechanics of Newtonian science and the solipsistic philosophies of Voltaire, Kant, Descartes, etc., suddenly erupted over unsuspecting humanity like the red-hot shrapnel of a fragmentation grenade. Up until then, the idea of a divinely ordained, harmoniously balanced system of creation, teeming with life, had been an eternal orthodoxy. Admittedly, it was an orthodoxy variously interpreted, but on the whole, it provided the diverse aspects of belief with a comforting framework within which the supernatural blended with the physically practical morphology of an ontological or religious understanding. In other words, people of all classes, philosophies, and races knew they were part of a wondrous universal scheme of things that transcended the physical limitations of a purely earthbound existence. To put it more simply, they knew they had precious, immortal souls, and that they carried within their innermost beings fragments of the sacred cosmic flame, the flame that was really the energizing fire of life that issued from the true source of being, the universal Godhead. This metaphysical ethos, brightly colored through all the highly complex facets of human perceived religions and philosophical teachings, has existed on this planet throughout recorded history. In the last 300 years, however, it has come under a witheringly constant attack that has seriously eroded much of its efficacy and credibility. It is the present contention that this highly organized and potentially devastating attack is no accident, and that the human protagonists of this assault of rationalism on spiritual beauty are not the true initiators of the conflict. This is really what the dark gods is all about. Even the previously mentioned diverse, brightly colored metaphysical ethos has not been immune from an exterior infection. Although a religious reality has been an orthodox assumption from at least Neanderthal times, it has not been devoid of heresies, schisms, persecutions, leading to pogroms, massacres, witch hunts, and ultimately to the hideous, fear-filled confusions of human beings in acute spiritual pain. This is what is meant by the religious impulse being a constant psychic irritant throughout history. It has never been allowed to be anything else. It has been systematically tampered with by certain sentient, discorporate forces that are inimical to the development of the human spirit, and always have been. We call these intelligent but highly evil forces the dark gods, and throughout this book we attempt to explain the techniques they use to manipulate human belief systems, and thereby control the destiny of life on this planet. A modern terminology for these forces is the ultra-terrestrial phenomenon, and it stems from the bizarre and again widely ridiculed writings of the flying saucer enthusiasts, who have been regaling the world with their exploits, theories, and strange religious philosophies for the last 3 decades. In what can almost be called the magic words, flying saucers, a vast complexity lies hidden. When the first detailed books on this subject began to filter through from the minor publishing houses in the late 40s and early 50s, it swiftly became apparent that strange things were manifesting in the wide skies of the planet Earth. When an American pilot, Kenneth Arnold, described the ethereally gleaming silver discs he saw skipping between the peaks of Mount Rainier in June 1947, people all over the world began to think again about the intriguing possibility that humanity was not alone among the starry gulfs of the galaxy. The initial impact of flying saucers, or UFOs, unidentified flying objects, was purely on a physical level, and they were mooted as craft sent to observe human culture by a superior, technologically advanced civilization from the far stars. But by 1953, the attitude to this phenomenon began subtly to shift into the metaphysical sphere. With the book Flying Saucers Have Landed, Werner Laurie, 1953, by George Adamski and Desmond Leslie, there was, among the wealth of historical data purporting to trace UFOs throughout history, an eyewitness account by George Adamski of the landing by Venusians in the Californian desert. These Venusians, as we shall see later, telepathically imparted to Adamski certain messages to humanity that were decidedly philosophical and religious in their undertones. This was the new beginning of what has come to be termed the contactee syndrome, that is, direct intervention in human affairs by extraterrestrial intelligences of widely differing form and purpose. The myths and legends of the world constantly recount how human beings have made contact with non-human entities, gods, demons, spirits, fairies, etc., sometimes being guided in the ways of truth and true spirituality, but more often being confused, misdirected, and regularly damaged in some way. The damage has ranged through the gamut of sociological, religious, and psychological disruption, often resulting in the madness or death of the initial contactee or prophet, and even the destruction of whole cultures and civilizations. It has always been a dangerous business when humanity has looked beyond the fragile envelope of atmosphere that cocoons the earth into the radiant, energy-filled depths of the universe, and many strange things have descended onto this world throughout its billions of years of existence. This is all carefully documented in the annals of the ancient writings, some secret and hidden, some open and accessible. But with the mass advent of the flying saucers after the Second World War, the contacting and the messages became more overt and at the same time deliberately confusing. The core of this book will document and qualify the above statements in exhaustive detail, the main purpose here being to present the reader with a more rounded introductory perspective, but even so, a little depth analysis will not go amiss because of the vast and terrifying nature of the conspiracy that is to be slowly unfolded. The incursions of the flying saucers and their diverse occupants into the affairs of Earth has steadily grown apace, with millions of people citing such phenomena on a worldwide basis. Detailed investigations into UFOs have been conducted by the military authorities of all nations, but because of the transitory, not to say unreal, nature of many of the sightings and contacts, the authorities have nearly always been dismissive of the idea that the phenomenon had any real substance. They have pontificated at length on the occurrence of mass hysteria, mass hypnotism, mass hallucinations, and equally on the fact, their word, that the sightings themselves are a misinterpretation of natural things, such as the planet Venus, cloud formations, ball lightning, and other meteorological manifestations. By reducing, and the word is used here in its blatant, philosophical sense, the flying saucers to rationalizations of natural phenomena, the authorities have sought to discredit their existence as purposefully intelligent intrusions from beyond, and to see them only in the light of human folly and credulity. This, of course, makes good sense from the rationalistic materialistic point of view, wherein only those things that conform to the so-called laws of science have any credibility at all. The whole immense range of what are increasingly called paranormal phenomena is excluded from investigation by the mandarins of modern scientific thinking because these blinkered, fully qualified gentlemen, who resemble nothing more than academic ostriches, have totally eschewed any form of cosmic consciousness in their rigid frames of reference, It is almost amusing to those who study long-term cyclical events in history, science, and religion to see that these frames of reference are so gleamingly new and immature that they positively squeak with embarrassment whenever they are put to the test. Science as we know it today stems directly from the mechanical universe as a great machine theory of Isaac Newton, which first took root in the 17th century. For the previous 5,000 years, at least cosmology was a delicate equilibrial blending of magic, science, religion, and philosophy, which, for instance, made astrology equally as important as astronomy. There was an all-embracing sense of visionary perception that saw nothing amiss in reconciling all forms of phenomenal reality into the general scheme of what this writer terms the magical pattern of creative existence. A Chaldean astronomer priest had no difficulty in recognizing signs, wonders, and portents in the sky, and he would interpret them as shadows of heavenly activities reflecting onto the earth with direct consequences to humanity. As above, so below. A modern astronomer, seeing the universe as a series of non-related bangs, flashes, and cosmic skateboarding, ever expanding, although what it expands into outside itself is never fully explained, scoffs at flying saucers or any other paranormal event, and states categorically, it's all nonsense. Seen in historical perspective, which of these two distinguished and very real gentlemen can be considered the wiser and more cosmically mature? This simple analogy is actually a crucial one, because although the Chaldean astronomer priest was naturally open to the malign influences of the dark gods, he at least was aware of them and, more important, knew of ways to combat their more extreme interferences. The modern atheistic scientist, refusing even to consider the intrusive influence of devils or demons or UFOs into his cozy non-vision, presents a terribly vulnerable target for psychic attack and consequently has only rudimentary psychological defenses against them. But one might ask, and many will, how do UFOs interconnect with dark gods, devils, and demons? Surely the flying saucer experience, if it has any veracity at all, is one of Homo sapiens being watched over, investigated, or influenced by an advanced galactic civilization, probably stemming from the older stars that burn in the interior spirals of the Milky Way. It is indeed possible, in fact, it is highly likely, that our galaxy has produced cultures that set our current advancement on a level with terrestrial ants. It would be arrogance beyond belief to think that this third planet of a comparatively young sun is the only environment among trillions of other suns and planets to have produced high forms of life. Some of the flying saucer sightings, landings, and contacts might well be close encounters between living beings at different stages of cultural development. Indeed, in Robert Temple's immensely interesting book, The Serious Mystery, Sidgwick and Jackson, 1976, there is a mountain of evidence to suggest a definite extraterrestrial contact around 4000 BC between beings from the Sirius system, 8.8 light years away, and the embryonic Sumerian civilization in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. Other such examples are numerous, and a whole library of books dealing with such contacts has recently grown up, ranging from the flamboyant excesses of von Daniken to the more carefully argued theories of Andrew Thomas, Peter Colosimo, and of course, Robert Temple. Even these nuts and bolts ancient astronaut books are contemptuously dismissed by our hidebound academic experts, no matter how much factual evidence they assemble. But they are really only the tip of the UFO iceberg. The very fact that the authorities dismiss most bitterly the more psychic, metaphysical aspects of the flying saucer phenomenon is a measure of how confused they are about the whole issue. It must now be suspected that this is no accident. Lights, objects, and beings have been appearing in the air of Earth since time immemorial, and again there are mountains of factual data, historical records to corroborate these singularly strange events. But again, How does this tie in with the concept of the dark gods? When research into these fascinating subjects is carried out, it is remarkable how the ancient and modern UFO data dovetail and correlate, but naturally they are always couched in the particular cultural paradigm of the era in which they occur. For instance, in the societies of classical antiquity, and even in early biblical times, there is an abundance of documentation pertaining to visitations from above. These take the form of electrifying encounters with angels, spirits, beings clothed in white, and more significantly black, gods appearing surrounded by blazing nimbuses of light and apart from the entity to human contact. There are endless records of unusual aerial activities ranging from fiery chariots, silver shields, swords of light, molten disks, and countless comets, to the suns at midnight and moons at midday initiatory juxtapositions. In the Middle Ages, fairies, imps, demons, and all forms of wonder and fear tumbled regularly from the skies to delight, terrify, and generally stimulate the reality framework of watching humanity. Some of these visitations by both beings and the more abstract phenomena, if translated into contemporary terminology, would be instantly recognizable as classic flying saucer activity. The reason this activity is today manifesting itself in such a strictly scientific manner, spacecraft, men in silver suits, green aliens, weird technological gadgetry, and so on, is simply that this is a highly technological age, and the phenomenon has merely adjusted accordingly. It knows how to put up a good front. One thing remains constant, however, and that is that the overall aim of this ruthlessly paranormal interference in earthly activities seems to be the spreading of unrest and uncertainty among all the races of mankind. It is as if something is playing a vastly complex cosmic game with human beings, a game the outcome of which has, so far, been thoroughly divisive and genuinely malevolent in its effects on our religion, social systems, and individual realizations of the true nature of cosmic consciousness. Collectively, it has similarly affected our species' role in the system of universal reality by making sure we never attain to a concerted group consciousness through self-understanding that could possibly short-circuit its psychic operations and break through into the transcendent realization of the purpose of life and its seminal place in the divine pattern. The seemingly twin parallels of the metaphysical phenomena of the past and the flying saucer and related psychic effects pattern of the present are now converging in many people's minds as the same thing in a superficially different form. If, as many mystics have believed, this planet and all its life forms have been under a psychic siege for thousands, if not millions of years, it is surely time that the nature of the siege was made plain. The first step in solving any problem is to recognize that there is a problem in the first place. The second step is to define the nature of the problem and initiate action to erase or circumvent it. The third step is to carry that action through to a successful conclusion, and in so doing remove the problem once and for all. It is hoped that this book will at least define the nature of the problem and therefore allow individuals to take their own form of offensive action to clear their psyches of a spiritual cancer that feeds on humanity's fears and delusions as the legendary vampire feeds on living blood. It looks as if a form of psychic vampirism is a keynote in the long symphony of the dark gods, and as will be seen, vampires do play a major role in our story. As the secondary motif of the book, the first is psychic phenomena in general. The flying saucer syndrome still remains the most synthesizing of studies, where all the various psychic factors come together under one umbrella of experience. As noted above, the public awareness of their existence was considerably sharpened after the Second World War, when they appeared to throng our air lanes and even land and disgorge some extremely disconcerting occupants. Now that UFOs have been set into a somewhat broader perspective, it will be relevant to examine some of the contemporary reactions to their presence and see how the whole field of flying saucer study has steadily moved from the comparative simplicity of the extraterrestrial hypothesis to what is increasingly described as the ultra-terrestrial analysis, a concept of quite mind-shattering dimensions. It took 20 years, 1947 to 67, for the full implications to surface, and they were first really brought together by the diligent researches of an American journalist and investigator of general mysteries, John A. Keel. John Keel has studied strange phenomena and ancient mysteries all his working life and has published dozens of articles in various American and British magazines, such as Fate, Saga, Flying Saucer Review, and so on. From the mid-60s onwards, Keel has produced a series of books that gather together hundreds of oddities throughout the whole phenomenal perceptual range. Oddities of history, astronomy, archaeology, religion, zoology, geology, etc., tying them all into the overall concept of the UFO or flying saucer evaluation. In books like Strange Creatures from Time and Space, Our Haunted Planet, and his magnum opus, UFOS Operation Trojan Horse, Keel has carefully developed his theory of the ultra-terrestrials and their external manipulation of collective humanity through direct control of matter and the psychic faculties common to every individual. This painstaking American researcher began by accepting the conventional explanation of flying saucers, that is, visitors from other worlds. But as his studies expanded through so many different fields, he gradually realized that there was a common, linking thread throughout UFO history, and that thread was of a decidedly psychic nature. In Strange Creatures from Time and Space and Our Haunted Planet, John Keel summarizes the ultra-terrestrial theory thus: they are the phantoms that come crashing out of the bushes late at night. They seem to be part of something else, something sinister and even hostile to us. This nucleate phenomenon has always existed on this planet and has taken many forms. Some of the unbelievables we have described may have been transmogrifications or disguises for the central phenomenon. They materialize when lightning courses across the sky or certain magnetic conditions prevail in window areas. They are not real or physical in the usual sense of those terms, but they are real enough while they last. They are paraphysical and can assume the forms of one-eyed giants stepping out of magnificent flying machines, or long-fingered Orientals driving around in black Cadillacs, which can melt into the air. Their shenanigans over the past several thousand years have spawned many of our religious and occult beliefs. In trying to record their activities, we have built up a literature based upon nonsensical manipulations and induced hallucinations. Cults and small groups of independent researchers have sprung up, each dedicated to one minor group of manifestations, each unable to view or grasp the whole. The demonologists have been studying the same thing as the ufologists: demonomania, possession of a human mind or body by an outside force, produces classic patterns and symptoms well known to psychiatry. These patterns appear in many cases of UFO contact, but have gone unrecognized. In psychical research, the same patterns are repeated. When a psychic or medium experiences these symptoms, they say they are overshadowed. All of these diversified groups are victims of the same phenomena, but they all see it from a different frame of reference and accept different explanations for it. In the 14th and 15th centuries, vampires ran amok in Central Europe, while fairies and little people literally engulfed all the territory between Germany and Ireland. Animals vanished or were found drained of blood. People vanished too. Three men, usually of Oriental countenance and dressed in somber black clothing, play important roles in both flying saucer and religious lore. For years, the flying saucer researchers who encountered these men in black, MIB, believed they were secret agents of the CIA sent to harass them. These MIB have been seen most often riding about in large black automobiles, usually Cadillacs, and they have engaged in frightening tactics, harassing amateur UFO sleuths. There are hundreds of reports from all over the world in which these mysterious gentlemen have approached UFO witnesses and investigators, warning, even threatening, them to be silent about what they had seen. Since these entities and their big black automobiles have an uncanny talent for disappearing into thin air, investigators examining the stories of their victims have tended to dismiss such accounts as lies and hallucinations. Then, as has happened in so many cases, when these skeptical investigators had MIB encounters of their own, they have panicked in confusion. There has been an appalling number of sudden deaths, suicides, and nervous breakdowns among UFO investigators in the past 20 years. On the religious level, these same MIB, answering the same descriptions of the UFO harassers, have always been regarded as agents of the devil, or the devil himself. The antics of these characters have kept the devil myth alive into modern times, and there are still numerous religious cults hopelessly engaged in battling and trying to outwit them, but they always manage to stay one jump ahead of their pursuers. Most of their deeds and manipulations appear to be nothing more than mischievous games. The activities of these parahumans are largely confined to specific areas of this planet, where they appear and reappear century after century. The angels keep their ancient places, poet Francis Thompson wrote. Thus there are many haunted places all over the world, shunned by ancient man or made sacred by him. These are precise geographical locations, and anyone digging into the history and lore of such locations will find thousands of accounts of ghosts, demons, monsters, and flying saucers pinpointed within a few square miles and covering 1,000 years or more of time. To UFO cultists, such places are windows, entry points for spaceships from some distant planet. Occultists teach that these are gateways, weak spots in the Earth's etheric envelope, through which beings from other space-time continuums seep through into our reality. Researchers are only now beginning to untangle the cycles involved. For some unknown reason, a high proportion of all these activities seems to occur on Wednesdays and the 24th of the month. This has been a stable factor throughout history. The biblical prophet Zechariah reported, Zechariah 1:7, an angelic visitation upon the 4th and 20th day of the 11th month, circa 520 BC. The most famous flying saucer sighting of modern times, that of private pilot Kenneth Arnold near Mount Rainier in Washington, occurred on 24th June 1947. The flying saucers are merely another frame of reference to provide us with an acceptable explanation for some of these grotesque events. An invisible phenomenon is always stalking us and manipulating our beliefs. We see only what it chooses to let us see, and we usually react in exactly the way it might expect us to react. Every culture on Earth has legends and stories about the same thing, even the completely isolated tribes of the Pacific Islands and the remote inland villages of South America. It has taken John Keel many years of hard work and much soul-searching to reach these conclusions, for, as he admits himself, he started on the long trail of the saucers as a skeptical, hard-headed atheist. Keel was not the first, and he will most definitely not be the last, to experience a conversion of consciousness after delving into the peril-fraught mysteries of the dark gods. In a book that is highly self-explanatory from its title alone, UFOS, Operation Trojan Horse, Keel refines his whole thesis to a most lucid level, correlating dozens of UFO reports, including the now widely discussed close encounters of the third kind, i.e., contacts, and juxtaposing them with the legendary psychic material on both a historical and a contemporary basis. One of the most significant passages from UFOs, Operation Trojan Horse, reads, "For thousands of years, the occultists, spiritualists, and religionists have talked about and written about auras, frequencies, vibrations, and other planes of existence. Each group developed its own complex vocabulary for explaining and defining these things. Each tried to fit its theories into its own particular frame of reference. Thus, these other planes became the Valhalla, where worthy spirits ascend upon death. The casual browser leafing through this mountain of literature is usually repelled by the nonsensical terminology and the abstract theories. Yet, underneath all of the belief-ridden folderol, there lies a thread of truth which is now being verified by the many manifestations surrounding the UFO phenomenon. I will try to demonstrate that the UFO entities are directly related to the entities and manifestations involved in religious miracles and spiritual seances. There are many thousands of published messages from both the UFOnauts and the spirits, all of which employ the same techniques for burying information deep in simple-minded descriptions about life on other planets or other planes. One of the most important correlations is that many of these messages have discussed in depth the existence of another reality, which is formed by energies operating on another frequency or vibrationary level. Throughout the 300 pages of his book, Keel most certainly demonstrates that UFO entities directly relate to religion, miracles, spiritualism, and so on. And Operation Trojan Horse has become a useful weapon in the armory of those few who now openly combat the ultra-terrestrials on their own level of psychic reality. This book is offered as another weapon in that same steadily growing armory, and will equally try to demonstrate numerous examples of the phenomenon in an explanatory context. But of course, as John A. Keel would be the first to acknowledge, many earlier UFO researchers had come to the conclusion that the phenomenon had a religious source, which was vibrationally multidimensional in the majority of its manifestations. Keel himself has quoted the fundamental and unequivocal statement of Air Marshal Sir Victor Goddard, KCB, CBE, MA, at a public lecture on UFOs held at Caxton Hall, London, on the 3rd of May 1969. Sir Victor said that while it may be that some operators of UFO are normally the paraphysical denizens of a planet other than Earth, there is no logical need for this to be so. For if the materiality of UFO is paraphysical and consequently normally invisible, UFO could more plausibly be creations of an invisible world coincident with the space of our physical Earth planet than creations in the paraphysical realms of any other physical planet in the solar system. Given that real UFO are paraphysical, capable of reflecting light like ghosts, and given also that, according to many observers, they remain visible as they change position at ultra-high speeds from one point to another, it follows that those that remain visible in transition do not dematerialize for that swift transition, and therefore their mass must be of a diaphanous, very diffuse nature, and their substance relatively etheric. The observed validity of this supports the paraphysical assertion and makes the likelihood of UFO being Earth-created greater than the likelihood of their creation on another planet. The astral world of illusion, which on psychical evidence is greatly inhabited by illusion-prone spirits, is well known for its multifarious imaginative activities and exhortations. Seemingly some of its denizens are eager to exemplify principalities and powers. Others pronounce upon morality, spirituality, deity, etc. All of these astral exponents who invoke human consciousness may be sincere, but many of their theses may be framed to propagate some special phantasm, perhaps of an earlier incarnation, or to indulge in an inveterate and continuing technological urge toward materialistic progress, or simply to astonish and disturb the gullible for the devil of it. This distinguished gentleman, who had a fine war record and has held various high positions in aviation, was also active in the RAF's investigations into flying saucers carried out in the early 50s. Sir Victor's recognition of the illusion-prone spirits, the dark gods, is a 20th century echo of the great biblical prophets who themselves had regular intercourse with principalities and powers, not always of a noble and peaceful disposition towards the human race. Other notable researchers who have embraced the ultra-terrestrial theory have been Dr. Mead Lane, Dr. Morris K. Jessup, Wilbert Smith, Frank Edwards, Jacques Vallée, and Brad Steiger. Dr. Lane was director of the Borderland Science Research Associates at San Diego, California, and was noted as a leading exponent of the fourth dimensional answer to the UFO problem. He, more than any other researcher of his time, sought to pinpoint UFOs on what the occultists would term the etheric level. In one of his numerous writings on the subject, Dr. Lane neatly analyzed the ultra-terrestrial structure pattern of the phenomenon in semi-scientific terms. These terms would in no way embarrass any practicing magician or occultist, but they certainly embarrassed the scientific establishment. To quote, aeroforms, UFOs, are best understood as emergence. That is, they emerge onto our plane of perception from a space-time frame of reference, which is different from ours. This process may also be described as a conversion of energy and a change of vibratory rates. When this conversion takes place, the aeroform becomes visible and tangible. It appears to be, and definitely is, what we call solid substance, and so remains until the vibratory rate is again converted. The steel of a landed disk is etheric steel, and its copper etheric copper. This change amounts to a process of mat and demat, materialization and dematerialization. Just as there is a spectrum of sound and color, so there is also a spectrum of tangibility, ending in forms of matter which are too dense to be touched. The ordinary matter of our plane is a rarefaction. The interspaces between the nucleus and the electrons are relatively enormous. This extremely dense matter of the ethers passes through Earth's substance, much as wind or water would flow through a screen with meshes a mile wide. But if the vibratory rate of an etheric object is slowed down, it becomes less dense and enters our field of perception. This idea of vibrationally unstable sendings from other planes of reality is common throughout all magical lore, and so the strange adaptability of the UFO manifestation is made dramatically clearer. Dr. Lane's most famous work is entitled The Coming of the Guardians, privately published in 1955. Some of its reverberations are still ringing quite ominously today. Dr. Lane, Dr. Jessup, and Frank Edwards all died in somewhat mysterious and suspicious circumstances, and many flying saucer students hold the view that they were deliberately removed from the game because their findings were coming uncomfortably close to the truth. This seeming paranoia is not to be dismissed lightly, for there seems to be definite evidence relating to savage reprisals being taken by the ultra-terrestrials upon any researcher who begins to recognize the magical aspects that lie behind their technological hardware front. Two more recent suicides in the world of UFO research have their own decidedly sinister overtones. On 13th June 1971, Dr. James E. McDonald, a senior physicist at the Institute of Atmospheric Physics and professor of meteorology at the University of Arizona, was found dead in the desert near Tucson. Dr. McDonald was an acknowledged expert on UFOs who had been highly critical of the U.S. Air Force's handling of the public information about the phenomenon. Dr. McDonald was also an outstanding speaker and writer on flying saucers, and just before his death, he was discussing the possibility that aliens were already among us, some holding high governmental positions. He was a man at the peak of his powers and his profession, having no apparent reason to take his own life. His lonely death in the desert was quickly declared to be suicide, but did he know too much about the planned logistics and ultimate purpose of the phenomenon? The suicide of Professor Rene Hardy is even more sinister. This world-renowned savant was a prolific inventor with over 250 patents to his credit in the fields of electronics, ultrasonics, radio, and optics. He was noted for his interest in ufology, parapsychology, and the problems of interstellar navigation. On 12th of June 1972, Professor Hardy was found dead with a bullet in his head and a gun in his hand, 2 days before he was due to announce a major discovery concerning extraterrestrial phenomena. Again, here was a successful and respected man apparently committing suicide for no clear reason at a crucial moment in his career. No social reasons could be advanced to explain away his sudden demise. There followed a very curious incident at his funeral. Among the mourners, there were noticed 6 tall men whom nobody present knew or could account for. Photographs were taken of all the assembled congregation, but when printed, none of them showed any trace of these 6 tall men. Although they were apparently unconnected with UFOs, there have been a number of suicides among eminent scientists in England during 1978. In each case, the man concerned was on the verge of a breakthrough in his specific field. The dramatic number of deaths among the witnesses and investigators of the Kennedy assassination needs no comment here. But when all these coincidences are gathered together, a disturbing pattern does begin to emerge. It is suggested that this pattern is not unconnected with the cosmic conspiracy that will be documented as this book unfolds its many secular and religious mysteries. All of the researchers listed above, including John Keel, have or had been plagued by odd accidents and misfortunes as their studies progressed and their conclusions developed a more psychic dimension. The most classic case of all was the visitation of the 3 men in black, MIB, who visited the UFO researcher Albert K. Bender in September 1953. At that time, Bender ran an excellent flying saucer bureau in Bridgeport, Connecticut, USA. He had been gathering a great deal of connecting information on many facets of the flying saucer mystery for some years. He had written to a friend that all the missing pieces of the pattern had now come together, and he had the true explanation for the phenomenon at last, which he included in the letter. Bender sent off his letter in September 1953, and then, a little later, received his terrifying social call from those famous hatchet men from the Ultra-Terrestrial Intelligence Bureau. They arrived on his doorstep one day, unsolicited and unwelcome, and one of them was holding the letter Bender had posted so recently to his friend. This case has become famous, or, more accurately, notorious, in UFO lore, and its known details have been given in a number of books. Gray Barker told the Bender story, but not all of it, in his They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. First published in 1956, Bender himself wrote Flying Saucers and the 3 Men, published very belatedly in 1962. But even this book was cloaked in a circuitous and ambiguously rambling smokescreen of interpretation that hid more than it revealed. Why all this secrecy, paranoia, and literary shadowboxing? The answer is in many ways revealing of the true nature of the problem. The Men in Black, today known somewhat apprehensively and universally among ufologists as MIB, seem to be the phantom police arm of the ultra-terrestrial phenomenon. And as Keel says, they have a historical pedigree dating back hundreds of years. They are usually somewhat demonic in appearance, dark-skinned, slant-eyed, very tall, and radiating strong auras of total menace. The 3 MIB who dropped in on Albert K. Bender proceeded to tell him that he had assuredly cracked the flying saucer mystery, but had not fully realized some rather nasty but certainly salient details. It was when these emissaries from beyond enlightened Bender as to what these details were that he quickly became very sick and remained ill for some days after. Although the full truth of Bender's experience has never surfaced, enough is known to fit it firmly into the ultra-terrestrial framework. The knowledge imparted to this one-time tireless seeker after truth caused him to drop every aspect of his work and retire into a carefully guarded obscurity. What little information that has filtered out through various friends and fellow researchers is of a decidedly magical and psychic nature. It appears Bender was subjected to an intense experience that is known in occult circles as illumination, a basic magical process used by the central hierarchies of all occult groups and secret societies. During illumination, the final, inner secrets of the cult or society are imparted to the Hierophant, and they are often diametrically opposed to the outer, surface teachings of the order. They are also sometimes extremely distasteful in their physical, sociological, and even cosmological revelations. This is all part of the confusion effect, the main plank in the ultra-terrestrials' long control and manipulation of human belief systems. During the course of Bender's interview, the men in black allegedly changed into non-human monsters of a distinctly serpent-like nature. This speaks for itself, the devil often being associated with snakes, saurians, or even dragons. Some of the information made Bender realize that if generally disseminated, it would bring down all political systems, destroy the foundations of modern science, and produce a genuine mass hysteria among ordinary human beings. When he finally wrote his book, almost 10 years later, Bender again carefully disguised the truth behind an opaque, semi-mystical symbolism. He described being taken in astral projection to a secret UFO base hidden in the icy wastes of Antarctica, where he was yet again confronted by humanoid and monstrous creatures. The book, odd in its style and content, was judged as just another UFO contactee's dubious memoirs. What really happened to Bender was much more sinister than that. An interesting point, which leads us on to the next stage of analysis, is that Albert Bender began to suffer strange physical ailments after his MIB confrontation. The worst of these physiological disorders was a constant succession of very bad headaches. This after effect pattern is, and always has been, widespread among psychic contactees throughout history, the headache and mind interference symptoms being well to the fore in such seemingly orchestrated psychic onslaughts. Many mediums and prophets in general have had peculiar psychical physical properties which play important roles in their developing clairvoyance and seership. One of these cosmically motivated men will now be studied in depth because his very reluctant career in dealing with unknown forces forms a perfect microcosmic précis of the whole ultra-terrestrial game, although in this instance they lost. In the 1920s and 1930s, in what later became a very famous magazine, the legendary Weird Tales, a series of science fiction-oriented fantasy stories, began to shock and inform the great American public. The author of these somewhat pessimistic tales was an American writer of what has subsequently come to be termed weird fantasy, and his name was H.P. Lovecraft. As his stories were steadily published, they came to be seen as part of a gradually unfolding cycle of tales that made up the literary realization of the author's dreams and intuitive impulses. For cosmic visions and fancies had beset his oddly convoluted mind since early childhood. Lovecraft's character was a strange amalgam of fact and fantasy, for although he appeared to accept a rational, mechanistic view of the universe, there yet remained deeply embedded in the recesses of his psyche a vagrant strand of strongly realized unreality. This afforded him strange glimpses into worlds of cosmic abnormality, peopled by bizarre energies and frightening beings of both semi-human and non-human propensity. Such was the subject matter of his most famous novella, The Call of Cthulhu. This story was written in 1926, and it deals with the attempts, through human puppets using magic, of the ultra-terrestrials to break through the dimensional barriers and regain their old dominion of the earth. In this story, Lovecraft warms to his theme that humanity is really ignorant of the true nature of the universe because of an induced occluded vision, and that any sudden understanding of cosmic realities would drive half mankind mad and suicidal and reduce the other half to an insane violence. UT controlled, of course. Lovecraft maintains that the coming in unshrouded splendor of the entities he sometimes terms the Ancient Ones or Great Old Ones would usher in a never-ending dark age of fear and chaos. In The Call of Cthulhu, the first-person narrative relates how evidence for an ancient cult of Old Ones worship is slowly pieced together from various archaeological, anthropological, and mythological fragments. It appears that these entities are clustered in another vibrational, dimensional level and can come into this world only through specific window areas or psychic gateways. These non-fictional tenets are fundamental in all the variedly extant occult theories. Lovecraft maintained that the Great Old Ones had first discovered the Earth while roaming among the stars. He stated that they died, became nullified in this world when the stars under which they ruled changed their position in eternity's heavenly cycle. This dramatic change naturally took millions of years before attaining its full transition. When the cycles wheel and the stars form their right conjunctions again, the old ones find it possible to return. This return can be and is facilitated by corrupted human magi using a lot of blood and the terrible inherited rituals of black magic. That, in essence, is the Call of Cthulhu, a horror story based upon deep and careful research in truly occult theory. Cthulhu is one of the old ones associated, on Earth, with water and is described as a monstrous, tentacled thing, bubbling with horrible energies, greenish in color and of immense size. He dwells in R'lyeh, a mighty megalithic city that lies beneath the Pacific Ocean, whose architecture conforms to no terrestrial geometry, non-Euclidean. In the tale, the old ones communicate with some human beings through dreams. If the subject is amenable, the dreams give instructions. If the subject is resistant, they give pain, fear, and madness. There is also a brief but telling description of what will happen in the world when the old ones regain full possession. Mankind would become free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel, and all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. There is a marked similarity in this passage to the inner teachings of those revolutionary secret societies that come under the general heading of the Illuminati. Adam Weishaupt, 1748 to 1830, the Bavarian scholar-magician who codified the magical teachings of the Assassins, the Gnostics, the Rosicrucians, the Templars, and the Freemasons, to name but a few, under the umbrella of Illuminism, is a classic case of the double standards maintained by such UT-infected orders of esotericism and their power-hungry agents. On the outer surface, his Illuminism was dedicated to the overthrow of tyrannical political systems, the freedom of the individual, and the enlightenment of true spiritual revelation. In private letters, revealed by the historian Nesta Webster in her book Secret Societies and Subversive Movements, reprinted Omni Publications, Weishaupt confided to initiated Illuminati that the real, inner purpose of the group was the blind overthrow of all forms of order, the communication with powerful beings, and the establishment of the illuminated minority as a new ruling elite to mold mankind according to the wishes of the spiritual powers. All accepted standards of goodness and truth were to be abolished, and in the words of a more contemporary illuminated black magician, Aleister Crowley, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Doing what they wanted without any formal moral obligation to their fellow creatures was naturally the prerogative of the self-appointed illuminated elite. In this they were, and are, only acting out the evil wishes of their non-human masters, the dark gods. Under the later heading, The Cosmic Battleground, the Illuminati conspiracy will be studied in the context of the ultra-terrestrial theory and the modern occult revival. Being widely read, Lovecraft cunningly wove all this esoteric but brutally realistic fact into his commercial fiction. But he always maintained in private that the ultra-terrestrials remained horribly real in his own dreams and imaginings. In all his stories, he said that these beings spanned the dimensional interstices of space and time, lingering upon the edges of the rational world as horrific, endlessly besieging entities, multidimensional creatures who were once lords of this earth and who forever lurk on the fringes of human consciousness, waiting to return. It is the purpose of this book to look closely at these far from fictional entities, and the work and imagination of H.P. Lovecraft makes a perfect focusing point. Hidden behind the undoubted irregularities in his style, there exists a natural, lucid understanding of the psychic world that functions beyond the boundaries of everyday reality. Lovecraft was a classic victim or unconscious medium for the extracosmic sendings of the dark gods, as a close study of his life will reveal. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born on the 20th of August, 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island, USA. Apart from an abortive marriage in 1924, including a short sojourn in New York, and brief trips to various parts of the country for antiquarian purposes, he remained in Providence all of his short life. He was, in fact, a recluse, preferring the company of his own brilliant imagination to the physical presence of what he once termed the herd-like nonentities who swarmed around him. Except for a small circle of close friends and a large circle of correspondents, Lovecraft was an inveterate letter writer. This mysterious man founded his lifestyle on the unraveling of certain creative patterns that he discovered running through the collective mythologies of human history. Part psychologist, part anthropologist, part myth maker, H.P. Lovecraft forged a shining and coherent design from distorted fragments of human understanding, finally presenting a picture of cosmology and science that was original, shocking, and, what is much more important, poetically non-rational. Its frightening reverberations have been echoing through people's minds ever since his death on the 15th of March, 1937. Although couched in the guise of fiction, the Lovecraftian mythos is really a distillation of the writer's most intuitive perceptual intimations. It is the contention here that some of these perceptions sprang directly from the baleful influences of the ultra-terrestrials as part of their confuse and terrify humanity game. As a small boy, Lovecraft quickly showed an amazing, if not uncanny, ability to absorb knowledge. He could read fluently at the age of 4 and spent all his time studying voraciously in his grandfather's extensive library. His first extant short story was written in 1896 when he was 6 and is called The Little Glass Bottle. It is an appropriately mysterious story of the sea. In his teens, he wrote many articles for the American amateur press, ranging in content from astronomy through philosophy to his early short stories on the occult and the supernatural. Throughout his life, he always claimed to get his direct inspiration mainly through his dreams. Despite his precocious intelligence, Lovecraft's bloodline contained a tragic and significant flaw. His father, Winfield Scott Lovecraft, was of English descent, stemming originally from farming stock in Devon, but he had become an advanced paretic soon after his son was born. He died in 1898, and his behavior during his last years was, to put it mildly, highly abnormal. At the tender age of 8, Lovecraft was absorbed under the black wing of his mother, Susan Phillips Lovecraft, and she calculatedly surrounded the child with a choking mantle, carefully woven from her own multiple hang-ups. She tormented him with his ugliness and tried to stifle his inquiring spirit by smothering him with an overprotective solicitousness. It was these selfish assaults upon his mind that left deep psychic wounds which never really healed. Susan Lovecraft spent the last 2 years of her life in the Butler Mental Hospital, Providence, dying insane in 1921. From this tragic background of mental and social instability, the young Lovecraft emerged shaken but unbeaten. He became a man of kindness, sensitivity, and knowledge, but he was always withdrawn into his own private world, where cosmic cycles wheeled in immensity, so sublimating the sad loneliness of his childhood. The devouring ministrations of his mother helped to turn the boy into a semi-invalid, for he was never strong, and in later life he became increasingly ill, finally dying at the age of 46 from a combination of Bright's disease and intestinal cancer. All his life he suffered terribly from severe headaches and dizziness, combined with an almost pathological loathing of low temperatures. The headaches are, of course, a basic contact D symptom, as shown. He was only physically comfortable at a heat of 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and if the temperature dropped to 70 degrees, he became increasingly agitated to the point of obsession. Anything lower than 60 degrees produced severe physical malfunctions, and there is a story, non-apocryphal, that he ventured out one day in winter when the thermometer read 30 degrees and quickly collapsed, needing instant and prolonged medication. It is clear from all this that Howard Phillips Lovecraft was a decidedly odd character beset with numerous external pressures. But this departure from normal human standards finally enhanced his personality rather than detracted from it. From earliest childhood, Lovecraft stood intellectually alone. He was a natural outsider. As an adult, he seldom left the house by day, but weather permitting, he did roam the streets of Providence at dusk and during the night, mainly in summer. And from these nocturnal quests, he drew both psychic and literary inspiration to fortify his superb imagination. From his earliest years, this strange amalgam of dreamer and scientist had studied the heavens, delighting in the awesome grandeur of the revealed universe and its brightly emblazoned patterns of stars. He sensed by pure intuition that the bowl of night contained wondrous energies of magical dimension and eerie beings that swam in the immensities as vast congeries of swirling light and color. All his life, Lovecraft was subjected to vivid dreams and visions that triggered his mental synapses into a weird variety of patterns and multi-dimensional awareness. He wove these dreaming visions into the ornate tapestry of his tales, where they glow before the eyes of any reader who ventures within the compass of his tremendous imaginative talent. Basically, the whole Lovecraft oeuvre is an awful warning to humanity not to indulge in any form of intercourse with the dark beings from beyond the stars. Some of his stories draw totally upon dreams, and in certain instances they can almost be described as automatic writing. For example, in a letter to his friend Reinhard Kleiner, written on the 4th of December 1921, Lovecraft explained how inspiration for a poem on the cosmic entity he termed Nyarlathotep came to him during the course of a vivid nightmare. Nyarlathotep is a nightmare, an actual phantasm of my own, with the first paragraph written before I fully awaked. I have been feeling execrably of late. Whole weeks have passed without relief from headache and dizziness, and for a long time 3 hours was my utmost limit for continuous work. I seem better now. Added to my steady ills was an unaccustomed ocular trouble, which prevented me from reading fine print, a curious tugging of nerves and muscles which rather startled me during the weeks it persisted. Amidst this gloom came the nightmare of nightmares, the most realistic and horrible I have experienced since the age of 10, whose stark hideousness and ghastly oppressiveness I could but feebly mirror in my written fantasy. The first phase was a general sense of undefined apprehension, vague terror which appeared universal. I fell in with them, zombie-like men, afraid yet eager to see and hear the great, the obscure, the unutterable Nyarlathotep. After that, the dream followed the course of the enclosed story, almost exactly, save that it did not go quite so far. It ended a moment after I was drawn into the black yawning abyss between the snows, and whirled tempestuously about in a vortex with shadows that once were men. I added the macabre conclusion for the sake of climactic effect and literary finish. As I was drawn into the abyss, I emitted a resounding shriek. I thought it must have been audible, but my aunt says it was not, and the picture ceased. I was in great pain, forehead pounding and ears ringing, but I had only one automatic impulse: to write and preserve the atmosphere of unparalleled fright. And before I knew it, I had pulled on the light and was scribbling desperately. Of what I was writing, I had very little idea, and after a time I desisted and bathed my head. When fully awake, I remembered all the incidents, but had lost the exquisite thrill of fear, the actual sensation of the presence of the hideous unknown. Looking at what I had written, I was astonished by its coherence. It comprises the first paragraph of the enclosed manuscript, only 3 words having been changed. I wish I could have continued in the same subconscious state, for, although I went on immediately, the primal thrill was lost, and the terror had become a matter of conscious artistic creation. The quotation from this letter is necessary because it covers, in Lovecraft's own words, many of the points postulated in the preceding paragraphs. The sense of cosmic horror and the presence of nameless forces seep through the lines of this letter in a truly terrifying manner, for Lovecraft was often in the grip of unknown forces and impulses, sometimes strongly against his own volition. Therefore, if his unusual physical properties are examined in conjunction with his pronounced intellectual otherness, it becomes possible to view H.P. Lovecraft as more than an eccentric writer of weird stories. In the light of certain new knowledge relating to the cosmic forces and their interaction through physical matter within a terrestrial environment, the peculiarities in Lovecraft's behavior and intellect become explicable in a more universal context. A simple yet effective analogy would be to compare him to a cosmic tuning fork, a being who was both a receiver and a transmitter of vibrational energy, emissions that functioned among the higher realms of astrometaphysics. Many of his physical oddities and infirmities had no real basis in actual medical conditions, but seemed to stem from external pressures that flooded into his brain, mostly during the night. If Lovecraft was an unconscious medium for ultra-terrestrial forces, it would explain the seeming dichotomy of his outward acceptance of a mechanistic universe and his inner, more intuitive realization that imagination and fantasy really ruled the cosmos. As Blake put it so wisely and beautifully, everything possible to be believed is an image of truth. Lovecraft's psychic truths came to him through the darkness, carried, as he might have put it himself, on the night-black wings of star-spawned creatures, dreaming eternally through the abyss of the interstellar void. Looking beyond the poetry and the high adjectival content, Lovecraft's prose can now be seen as coded messages of crucial psychic importance, thinly disguised as imaginative fiction. Many of his stories, especially those that he wrote towards the end of his life, contain hints and pointers that form a series of closely interlinked clues to the labyrinthine and magically orthodox mythology he gradually evolved. It was this root mythology, which came to be termed the Cthulhu mythos after its most gruesome entity, that contained the fruition of the author's dreams and psychic imaginings. Lovecraft tapped some very bizarre sources in his endless researches into transdimensional knowledge, and the fact that much of this tuning in was unconscious in no way detracts from its objective reality. A multiplicity of cosmic forces permeates the whole structure of the plenum, and certain individuals, with the correct psychical and emotional alchemy, have always been able to focus and amplify them. Mediums, seers, magicians, occultists, and mystics have all, in their own way, seen through the opaque veils that surround the concept of rationality, and throwing them aside, have reached up towards those forms of higher consciousness that free the human spirit from its rational material envelope. H.P. Lovecraft was no conventional mystic or seer. Indeed, he held forth scornfully throughout his life on the ludicrous self-delusion of most of these seekers after spiritual insurance. He even wrote a long article in 1932, in collaboration with his friend, the writer C.M. Eddy, entitled The Cancer of Superstition. This article mercilessly flays those self-appointed prophets who set themselves up as the final arbiters of other people's spiritual beliefs. In fact, the human race never ceases to be plagued by these sinister charlatans whose only pleasure in life seems to be the denying of natural happiness or pleasure to other people, mainly by anathematizing sex or freethinking, calling both these highly normal pursuits dirty or disobedient. To the single-minded authoritarianism of these false prophets and their dark masters, any act that liberates the human spirit from their intolerant shackles is seen as wrong, mainly because it undermines their authority to bewilder and terrorize their hapless victims. Lovecraft realized and wrote that the superstition and pseudo-mystical mumbo-jumbo taught by many priests, redeemers, messiahs, and sons of God all stemmed from a basic insecurity in the human condition relating to the feared personal oblivion of death. Anyone with a modicum of intuition knows that physical death is a mere transitional phase between two very different states of consciousness, and this knowledge does not need to be constantly reiterated by spurious spiritual advisors. Any study of the constantly recurring cycles of nature induces a recognition of immortality that is both simple and complex, for the steady replenishing of the natural rhythms of life shines strongly from every leaf and flower if looked at with the eye of vision. It is this vision, which might be termed Blakean transcendent consciousness, that the ultra-terrestrial forces seek constantly to distort or destroy, for they rule most overtly by fear and low-minded negation. Lovecraft's castigation of the misguided dupes and egotists who continuously pollute the spiritual consciousness of the human race is as valid today as it was in 1932. He brought the severe clarity of his razor-sharp mind to bear upon much of the diseased nonsense that passes for enlightenment, and in so doing opened the way to genuine recognition of cosmic consciousness in its purer, more universal context. That is, the combining of humanity's natural, archetypal vision with the transcendent forces and patterns that dictate the function of all existent reality, the living universe and its dynamic energies. Thus the cycle of intuitive understanding is fulfilled. Thus the rhythms of cosmological equilibrium, spiritual harmony are constantly maintained. Please stay tuned for the second part of this audiobook. As starseeds, we must remember to chew the meat and spit out the bones. Peace, blessings, and much love and enlightenment to you all. Shalom.